All right, today we are talking about the Persian Empire. We are only going to go up to Darius, and then we will pick back up with the Persian Empire when we talk about the Persian Wars with the Greeks. So we're kind of splitting it up a little bit, and we'll also mention the Persians when we talk about Alexander the Great. As he conquers the Persian Empire. So I guess it's broken into three different parts. Not a ton with Alexander the Great outside of how it's connected to him, but we definitely will be talking about the relationship with the Persian Empire with Darius and Xerxes when they're fighting the Greeks. So like I said, this is just the kind of introduction and looking at some of the earlier years of the Persian Empire. So first, let's talk about how we get to the Persian Empire and the early start. So I want to hear the questions to consider. How did the Persian Empire establish a system of effective control in such a large area? How did the cultural and religious structure differ from Mesopotamian societies? And why was Zoroastrianism unique? So we know, if we're looking at kind of early beginnings, we have the Medes. There's two groups that come out of this from the Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians, and they originated from the Indo-Europeans. And there were two groups. So the Indo-Europeans were migrating around from like around 2000 to 700 BCE. And they split into two groups that we've looked at. You have what becomes India with the Aryans, right? And that ends up as India. And then you have the other group, which ends up settling down just east of Syria. And this group breaks up into two, which become the Medes and the Persians. The first group to actually become an empire are the Medes. You end up with the Median Empire, not the Persians. We'll put here, the Persians end up as were a tributary state, right? And remember, with a tributary state, they have to pay taxes, and usually men for the military. So you actually have the larger empire was the Medes at the beginning. Obviously, they're going to take, the Persians are going to take over and then expand and become much larger long term. With the Medes, one of the main kings was Cyaxares, and he was connected to bringing down the Assyrians. He actually owed the Medes a portion of the end of the Assyrian Empire, so they help end the Assyrians, and they did this by setting up an alliance system with three other groups. So you have the Lydians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. So together, these four groups ended up successfully ending Assyria. And what you have is kind of in two, well, actually, I guess 3 parts from when they start. In 625, you have them starting to make actual attacks on Assyria. And then from this kind of repeated attacks, and why this even happened, one of the things is that Assyria had done, besides the torture, the deportation to manage revolts. But as Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had continued to expand and expand, they really couldn't hold on to their borders. I mean, this is always ultimately a problem. Any society that ends up expanding too far struggles to maintain and manage their borders. This is one of the things why I have that question: how did the Persian Empire establish a system of effective control in such a large area? Because it was super impressive that Persia was able to mitigate a lot of this problem. They would become the largest empire in the world for a period of time, and they set up an administrative system that's so effective that while there were revolts that did occur, they were rare, and they were able to effectively manage a much larger empire than others had done so before. And so Assyria ended up with the same problems: expanding too far, not being able to have the people or the resources to support such a large empire. And this meant they got sloppy, and they weren't able to deport and move around people in conquered areas as much, or even just simply attack and invade some of the larger empires. This allowed for the alliance system to happen, and then for them to begin attacking Assyria. You have the capital, the old capital of Babylon, Ashur, was defeated in 614. And then you have Nineveh in 612. Right, and this was the one where I mentioned, right, that when Assyria fell, everyone celebrated. It essentially was a collective celebration by the ancient Near East that that Assyria was no longer. I mean, they were hated that much. Okay, so that's the Medes with what we're going to look at. We're going to get into Persia here. And we're going to look at Persia and the transition to control, first through Cyrus. So Cyrus was the king of Persia, and he wanted to break from being a tributary ruler. And so one of the things that they had to do is annually go to the capital of the Median Empire and kind of go to the king and give tribute. It was meant to be like kind of a visual sign of not necessarily loyalty, but certainly submission. And so he uses this to essentially bring in part of the military and infiltrate the capital and then overthrow the Medes. So one of the very first things that he's known for was that he overthrew the Median Empire. And we'll look at the map in just a second with this, but let's set up what he does that's clever with this, because the system that he ends up setting up with the Medes first is important for kind of maintaining control, and then there's kind of a vast expansion after that. So with the Persians, and once he takes over Babylon, that marks the end of Mesopotamia. So the Persian Empire actually is kind of that demarcation of the Mesopotamian Empire or period is over. And that's ultimately because the Persians weren't Mesopotamians. The Medes weren't from that region, right? They were Indo-Europeans that had migrated to that region, but they weren't considered Mesopotamian, and their culture was fundamentally not Mesopotamian culture, right? You have the Neo-Babylonians, the Assyrians, although they weren't Mesopotamian in culture, they were from that region. And so, like I said, the Persians are that a marker for that change. So with the overthrowing the Median Empire, and what he could have done is he could have made them a tributary state. Instead, he incorporates the Medes into the Persian Empire. And there's a reason for doing this. One of the things that is to be considered with this is, he's not going to do this with other civilizations. And so why do it with the Medes, right? Well, they were culturally and the similar. There weren't a lot of differences between the Medes and the Persians. Some names, Darius or Darius, depending on pronunciation, is technically a Median name, but that just becomes Persian as in function. Some of their dress was slightly different, but like it's hard to distinguish when there's some carvings or pictures of who is a Mede versus who is a Persian. They had a very similar dialect in terms of language, right? So you had this cultural connection that made it easy to incorporate them in. And so they were not a tributary state. Persia is going to keep the tributary state for everyone else that they conquer, but the Medes end up not doing this. And then because they're not a tributary state, they get the benefits of the Persian state, which means they're not paying the tributary taxes. So let's see, we'll put that here. No tributary taxes. They also then can be part of the military, of the official Persian military rather than a tributary component, and more importantly, of the civil service, right, which is the administration, the bureaucratic system. What this ultimately does, right, is this assimilates them into one peoples, right? One group. Eventually there's no difference between Mede and Persian. They all just become Persian. So why, the question then is, why do this? We talked about, how they can do this and even the why of the cultural similarities, right? You have the cultural aspects that make it easier, right? Why not do it with the Babylonians? Why not do it with the Lydians? Well, because it's easier, because they were virtually the same. The other reason was, though, he had just revolted as a tributary state. So you want to prevent the Medes, who were a large empire and independent, from feeling dissatisfied now being under Persian rule and having to pay tribute. The way to do that is to do exactly what Cyrus did. And then this way you ended up with virtually no revolts, because essentially to revolt would be to revolt against yourself with this system. And it ultimately strengthened the Persian Empire, which is then going to allow him to attack the former allies of the Median Empire with this process, right? And then his next step was to take over the Lydians and the Babylonians. He does not get to Egypt. His son Cambyses is going to end up doing that. So let's look at the map here. So as you can see, at this just an older map, that's not the proper title anymore, but it works for showcasing the alliance really well with this map. So you have here the Median Empire in yellow. Here's Persia. And then here's the Median Empire with their capital here. And then you have Lydia, Babylonians, and Egypt, right? So these were the groups that they did an alliance to overthrow Assyria. So once Cyrus takes over and this all becomes the Persian Empire, right, the next step that he did was to conquer the Lydians. And there's a story with this that they were preparing to fight, and on the battlefield, they hadn't started yet, but they were getting ready to start, and there was an eclipse, and the Lydians took that as a sign and surrendered. Probably more myth than fact, but it's an interesting story that goes kind of fitting into the myth of Cyrus and the Persian greatness. Then they conquer Babylon. And from Babylon, this is where we're going to get the Edict of Cyrus. So he doesn't get to Egypt. He dies before conquering Egypt. His son will take Egypt. And we'll talk about Cambyses in a minute. Here is Cyrus. And he ends up with the title Cyrus the Great, in part because of the Edict of Cyrus and the policies that he set forth. That then, notwithstanding his son, who doesn't follow them, becomes a foundational aspect of kind of how Persia ruled. This is the cylinder for the Edict of Cyrus, which it was written on. And so, you know, it still looks similar to like the cuneiform style, but is in this kind of cylinder structure. And where they're missing a piece here, but this was intentionally like displayed for propaganda, and that's one of the things that we're going to look at, is that the Edict of Cyrus was propaganda, but it also was a system that he did in order to set up that foundation. So let's write just briefly the policies that that kind of become foundational, and then we'll look at the Edict of Cyrus. So, come on. Here, it wants to freeze on me. There we go. We will do... Here, we'll do this. Edict of Cyrus. Most of these were considered benevolent policies, where you don't have... there were no mass executions. There was no looting and pillaging. One of the things that was common in the ancient world was when an army conquered an area, that you could expect looting, pillaging, raping, that type of thing. And it was just kind of a sad fact of ancient warfare. We'll see that later when we talk about the Iliad and the Trojans, and you have the wife of Hector who actually tells Hector, like, you know, you're important because you're keeping us alive, and you know what happens if Troy falls. You know, she says, your infant son will be thrown over the wall, I'll be raped and then enslaved. And this was just seen as part of the consequences of warfare. Women were often seen as essentially loot that you won in warfare, and you, part of why people fought, besides for money or for glory, was what they could gain in wealth from looting areas that they conquered. So it's significant that Cyrus is going to say that he's going to prevent his soldiers from looting and pillaging and destruction. The other thing will be a general acceptance and tolerance, we could say, of other cultures and religions. He isn't going to make them change their religion. In fact, one of the things that becomes standard with Persian tributary states is, as long as you pay your taxes and you pay the tribute, you're free to, you know, live your life in your society the way that you want, with little interference. And that certainly was liked and well received by most people. That, right, as long as you weren't revolting, Persia was a pretty good place to be a tributary state to. If you revolted, we'll see under Darius and others that becomes a completely different thing. But as long as you weren't revolting, it was a pretty good place that way. And then he also is talking about how he not only allowed captured peoples to return home, but allowed them to restore their temples, their gods and their temples. Okay, so this, let's look at the source here. So the Edict of Cyrus, and I went over this before, but I want to just kind of go over it again within the context of the Persians. So right, this was written after Cyrus and the Persians conquered Babylon. So they came in and he wrote this. The first part here is just boasting about power. Right? I'm Cyrus, king of the globe, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer, king of Akkad, king of this and this and this and this, right? Look how powerful I am. I'm king of all these things. In fact, the Persian king ends up being called the king of kings, right? Because all these tributary states, most of them still had kings. And so he's the king of, a bunch of other kings. So the first part is totally just, look how powerful and strong I am. Then he talks about, so when I entered Babylon, I established the seat of government in the royal palace of the ruler amidst jubilation and rejoicing. Marduk, remember Marduk is the patron deity of Babylon, right? That's not a Persian god. Marduk is the patron deity of Babylon. The great god induced the magnanimous inhabitants of Babylon to love me, and I sought daily to worship him. So right here, right, he's saying, when I came into Babylon and set up the government in the palace, people, it was with jubilation and rejoicing. People were happy and celebrating. Marduk, your god. So, right, this is kind of to the Babylonian people, but it's also an edict for other people to see. It was meant to be kind of showcased as this, I'm Cyrus, and this is how I'm going to rule. So he's saying to the Babylonian people, though, Marduk, your god, right, made the great inhabitants of Babylon to love me, and I worshipped him daily. So, right, he's saying, look, you should be happy I'm here, because everyone was happy and they were celebrating. And not only that, but your God likes me and made sure that the people were happy for me being in charge, and I worship him. So we're good to go. And that this is important for when we talk about Zoroastrianism. At this point in Persian history, they're still polytheistic. Right? And that's going to change when Zoroastrianism comes into play. Persia is going to shift to a dualistic system. But in the very early years with Cyrus, they were still polytheistic. And polytheism, multiple gods, the more the merrier. There's no issue with adding other people's gods, because it's kind of saying the more you have, the better it is, because then you have more gods for things and it's potential to help you out, and like in this case. And then it says, right, when my numerous soldiers in great numbers, right? So twice here, it's meant to showcase their size, right? We had a massive army, peacefully entered Babylon and moved about undisturbed, right? I did not allow anyone to terrorize the people of the lands. So right there he's saying, right, look, we, normal warfare equals looting and pillaging and raping, right? I made sure that my soldiers did not do that. And so keep that in mind, that it could have been a whole lot worse. And then he keeps in view the needs of the people and all their sanctuaries to promote their well-being. So as to the inhabitants of Babylon who against the will of their gods were enslaved, I abolished the corvée which was against their social standing. This is very much, now the Hebrews or the Israelites were not the only ones that this applied to. Remember, Neo-Babylonia's policy was when they conquered an area, they took the nobility or the wealthy young boys, aristocratic boys, and they brought them into their town, for which then they raised them and trained them for the language, Babylonian administration, and they were paid, and they could get married, they could kind of have a life in Babylon, but they were not allowed to leave. They still were captives. But this was, the Assyrian method of deportation to prevent revolt was what the Assyrians did, and the Babylonians, to prevent revolt, essentially, tried to assimilate the aristocratic boys. So that you didn't have kind of lost your whole nobility or middle upper class group to the Babylonians. And it was effective. When they do have the opportunity to leave here, many choose not to, because the city of Babylon was very impressive. It was a massive cosmopolitan city. It had the Hanging Gardens, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a good place to live, and so it's not surprising that even though he freed them and they weren't no longer forced to kind of work within the administration and they could leave, many chose not to, because they were married, because they have kids, because they saw Babylon as their home. What's more impressive, as I mentioned before, is just that there were enough for people to go back and rebuild the temple. And to continue with, there was never a kingdom of Israel anymore. They were always a tributary state. But the fact that they even existed as a cultural group and a religious group is impressive. And part of the reason they were able to do that is because of this policy with Cyrus. And so he's saying, all those boys that were taken, and that is against their social standing to be slaves, and in this corvée is a common word we mentioned before, forced or taxed labor, right? They're free. And then I brought relief to dilapidated housing. And then he says, right, here's the propaganda. Marduk, the great lord, was well pleased with my deeds, right? So there's constantly propaganda mixed in with the stuff that he's actually doing. And they rejoiced at me, Cyrus, and then he makes sure his son Cambyses, who would, eventually take over after him, threw his son in there too, right? It's not just me that Marduk likes, he likes my son as well. He goes on, as far as this, the part that refers to Israelites and to the others that were captured, he talks about how the sanctuaries that had once been in ruins over long periods, the gods whose abode is in the midst of them, I returned them to their places and housed them in lasting abodes. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. So that what he did is the Babylonians would, when they conquered, they often destroyed the people's temples, and then they took all of their gods, the little statues of their gods, and they actually stored them in Babylon. For the Israelites, they didn't have statues of gods, but they had relics, and they looted the temple before they destroyed it, and then stored it. So Cyrus gave back to all the peoples that had been captured this way. He not only let them go, but then he gave them back their gods, or for the Israelites, their relics, and told them that they were free to go rebuild their temples and live their life, practice their religion, their cultural practices, and so on. So he's talking, that's this part here and here too. So then this is power again. This is definitely the propaganda, where he talks about, right, everyone brought their heavy tribute and kissed my feet in Babylon. And he's just listing all these areas for which he has control. And then he goes on right after saying, I returned to the people, and all of the gods were brought into Babylon, right, to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed to their former chapels, the places which make them happy. So this is connecting to, look, I'm helping the gods out. And then he says, right, may all the gods whom I have placed within their sanctuaries and resettled in their sacred cities address a daily prayer in my favor. So here it's like, hey, I helped you out, if your gods would bless me, essentially, or like me. It's more like this idea of, remember, right, I helped your gods. Not only you, right, up here where I freed you, or I let you go restore and rebuild your sanctuaries and your temples, but I helped your gods too. So a daily prayer to me isn't too much to ask. So that's this, right? But the important part of this document, besides the interesting kind of component of propaganda and kind of laying out that, is it set up a foundational structure for what most of the Persian kings are going to do. We'll see his son Cambyses is not going to do that. But outside of Cambyses, it was the main structure that the Persian kings followed. So Cyrus does this. He ends up dying before he is able to expand and conquer Egypt. Cyrus was seen as a decently likable guy, and as a ruler. The Israelites, they loved him. He ends up in texts that become part of the Old Testament, where they write about how great Cyrus was, that the God was influencing the hand of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was this awesome guy. Yes, the Hebrews, they loved Cyrus. So his propaganda in that sense worked great for on them, because they praised him up and down about how fantastic he was. They didn't mind being a tributary state under him. They didn't like it so much under the Greeks and the Romans, but under Cyrus, because he gave him back the temple and that opportunity, he was liked. So he ends up dying, and his son takes over. So put B here. We don't have a lot to talk about. You see, Cambyses was the son of Cyrus, and he only ruled for a short time, and it's a good thing that he didn't rule longer, because he might have completely destabilized Persia. So he did not follow the policies set by Cyrus. As I mentioned, right, everyone, Darius and others, are going to do so. Cambyses does not. He does conquer Egypt, right? And so that, I guess, an accomplishment that he did. And there, was expansion under him with the Persian Empire. But when he conquered Egypt, he plundered the temples, which was the opposite of what Cyrus had set up with the Edict of Cyrus, of I'm going to respect your gods. You get to go rebuild. That shouldn't have happened. Instead, Cambyses is nah, I'm going to plunder them. And when plundering the temples in Egypt, he ends up killing the bull of Apsus. And this was an actual bull. And the belief was that this bull, the god spirit, could manifest in the bull. So killing the bull was sacrilegious, one. And two, it wasn't exactly killing the god, but it was killing the god's vehicle to the world. And so, that was a big deal. It's definitely not. Plundering the temples is disrespecting the gods. Killing their representation or vessel was definitely disrespecting the gods. He would have done what is considered defiled the pharaoh's bodies, the dead pharaoh's bodies, as he raided tombs. None of the things that ingratiated himself to people. He also killed lots of people, lots of Persians. And there's a couple stories with him. So one was that he killed his brother, and then he ends up killing his wife and son. And then also nobility. Essentially kind of went on a killing spree. His brother was very popular, Smerdis, and he didn't like that. And so instead of killing him publicly where people saw him die, his brother just kind of disappeared in the night. And so rumors continued that Smerdis was alive and was going to come back and take over, which just kind of vexed Cambyses. He later killed his wife and son and relatives, all out of this fear and paranoia that everyone was out to get him and kill him and overthrow him. And then also killed off nobility kind of randomly. There was no rhyme or reason. He would just order the execution of large groups of people. And then he would sometimes change his mind. So there was like one case where he buried some nobility alive, and then partway through, like, tossing the dirt on them, changed his mind and ordered them to live. Another that he lined up and had people, to aim with bows and arrows to shoot them. So not surprisingly, people didn't like him. It's not hard to get at people have dislike you when you do this. And what ends up happening, he ends up dying, most likely being killed, assassinated. Although they write it off, or at least Herodotus writes it off as that. Herodotus is often considered the first Greek historian. We've talked about how a lot of in the ancient world, there wasn't a whole sense of history. The Hebrews were one of the first. Well, the Greeks, Herodotus was a historian. He wrote about histories, not only of the Greeks, but of other peoples. He went to Persia, got their stories. Now, it isn't the same as what we would think of a historian today. He very much intermixed the stories of the gods and people in history, all as historical fact, and probably just listened to what cultural stories and tales were part of their tradition and wrote them down. So there definitely is that part in there. But I mean, he went around and recorded what people believe to be their histories. And Herodotus wrote that Cambyses died by falling off of his horse and onto his sword. Now, this is possible, I suppose. It's would be difficult. Like I said, you could do it, but like it's just unlikely. Instead, it's likely that what the story that he was told, and then he wrote kind of skeptically, was that Cambyses was assassinated. Because just imagine like falling off your horse with the sword at the right angle that you end up dying. Especially if you're an experienced horseman and swordsman. Again, not likely. Instead, it's like, oh, well, probably some noble was like, I'm really not in the mood to die because of whatever weird, mood you're in. And he had enough people who hated him that they assassinated him. And then the story became, instead of saying, well, we killed the king, the story became he had an accident. He fell off his horse onto his sword. And, most people probably would have known exactly what that was. But it works to them, just people were fine with that. Sure, we'll go with that. Accident, and a wink. So that's the end of Cambyses. And it's a good thing, because here's the thing. When Cyrus died and his son took over, there was no revolt. When Cambyses died, there were two different events that Darius, who took over, had to deal with. So Darius, or again, Darius is the other way you hear it, took over a distant relative that wasn't part close enough to be executed in everything. The first thing that he has to do is fight revolt, and I suppose a rebellion in that, or challenge to his rule. So the first is that there was an individual who claimed to be Cambyses' brother. And he had a following. Again, Smyrnus was popular. The myth that he was still alive out there and at some point coming back held on to. So he had to put that down. And then the other thing that he had to do was a general revolt or rebellion with the Babylonians. And these are important because essentially what happens with this is that this is showcasing, one, the lack of confidence, not only in Darius. It was more about the fact of what Cambyses did, but what this does is that it forces him to have to convince the people, the Persians and the tributary states, right, that one, he was in charge and could control things, and two, that he was the rightful heir, you could say, right? That he or the rightful ruler. I don't think it's so much a family thing as just that he was the one that was rightfully in charge. And so he puts down the revolts in Babylon. He successfully beats back the person claiming to be Smerdis, and then puts down the revolt in Babylon. Now, this does become kind of a standard for Persia as well. And he not only beats them militarily, but then ends up impaling 3,000 leading citizens of Babylon, and puts them along, supposedly they lined the streets out of Babylon. This was meant to be a warning to other tributary states, right? You should think twice before you revolt. And this does become a standard, not the impaling, but a standard for Persia, which was that for the most part, they were, so we'll say normally, kind and tolerant. But if you revolted, then they could be quite vicious, and they put it down quickly and brutally. We'll see one of the things that kickstarts off the Persian Wars with Greece is the Ionian city-states. The Ionian city-states are connected to Greece. They're not directly Greek, but they were closer to the Greeks than anyone else. They were actually part of the Persian Empire as a tributary state. They decided to revolt, and they end up appealing to Sparta and Athens for help. But anyway, they get put down. The revolt, the city that the revolt started in, is easily conquered, and by the Persians. And then the whole town or city is burned to the ground, and all surviving men, women, and children that weren't killed in the battle are sold off as slaves. So harsh consequences for revolt. If you pay your tribute and you don't try to revolt, things are pretty good in the Persian Empire. If you do revolt, it's going to be a very, very harsh response. And that's meant to show power and force to prevent people from doing it. Now, that's not the only way they hold on to a large empire. It's one of the ways. So after this, Darius, he actually says like that, that he is done with fighting and warfare, and now his focus was to run an administration, a bureaucracy. And he sets up a very super effective system, because Persia does become the largest empire in the world. So one of the things then is, right, you have such a large empire, how do you run it effectively, and what's the structure? So one of the things that they create are satraps, and satraps are kind of like governors, and their job was that they were watched and reported to the king on the activity of their area, right? So they were essentially the eyes and ears of the king, because ultimately Persia was too large to manage with just the king. You had to have a large bureaucratic system, but having just a bureaucratic system, there's no centralization. It's difficult to manage. So the satraps then had their regions that they were responsible for, and they reported back the information to the king, how it was going, kind of the feel of the people, if they were, and they were also responsible for collecting taxes. And then they were supposed to provide information to the king. These were hand appointed by the king. So they were seen as trusted individuals, right? And then you have, of course, the fact that the function of the tributary states, which was taxes. But the importance with this is that they were not overtaxed, right? Each tributary state was taxed based on what was effective for them. And that's beneficial, because ultimately if you overtax a people, that can get oppressive, and then they're more likely to revolt. And so the taxes, right, was money, which ultimately makes Persia the wealthiest empire, which is beneficial for controlling things. And then you have men for the military, which also makes Persia the largest military, which, if you think about preventing revolt, if you're going to revolt and you're going up against the largest military in the known world, you might think twice about it. And then, so right, this is how they ran things, right? Satraps, tributary states with the taxes, they allowed the tributary states to maintain their religious and cultural practices. And this kept people happy, right? Because for the most part, and their rulers, and so people were less likely to want to revolt if they were content with the situation for the most part. And then there's just general benefits to being a tributary state. Okay, so one of those was protection. This doesn't really matter for those tributary states in the center, but if you're on the outskirts of the empire, and you're being attacked, you have the might of the Persian military behind you. We're also going to see commerce with one trade, and we'll talk about this with the royal highways in just a minute. The fact that it was cosmopolitan, so you have a lot of different cultures and technology and exposure, and then general wealth that emerges from that, and the ability to practice and retain your cultural traditions in all of this, right? So all of that plays a role in managing it. Now the other thing, what are we on, 5 here, were the royal highways. So let's look at the map for a second, and then we'll talk about what these provided. So here was Cyrus's tomb. It's not tiny, but it's definitely simplistic, which I think is appropriate for kind of how Cyrus is described. He's often described as kind of a no-frills person and over the top. This is also indicative of that they weren't yet extremely wealthy. By the time of Darius, Persia is insanely wealthy, and that gets reflected in the way that the nobility lived. Darius's tomb, Persia just skyrockets in wealth, and they're definitely not poor here. This is also, like I said, indicative of kind of Cyrus's character, but they also weren't extremely wealthy like we see where we're at with Darius now. So this cuts off a little bit. The Persian Empire actually goes out to here in Bactria. So you have India, and you have Bactria. So I'm sorry, this one cut off. But why I picked this map here is because all of these red lines are the royal highway. And this was part of the effective nature of the controlling a large empire. So let's say you have a tributary state here, right? Persia and Persepolis, which is the capital, is right here. And then let's say, oops, there's Darius, we'll come back to him. Let's just say that the end of the empire is over there. From like getting information from here to here, or even here to the capital, in the past, right? Let me get this so you can see, since I put a lot of lines, would have taken months, right? So you're looking at months to get information. By creating a system of roads, though, it allows for faster communication. And I'll write this down on the notes, so I guess I won't write it all right here too. Faster communication. So that if there's an important thing like, hey, the people are getting discontent here, over here, then the king can address that before it turns to revolt. Or just knowing what's going on over here, and not having such a massive disconnect. The other thing, of course, is that it allows for faster travel. Roads that are well constructed mean people can travel faster. This goes into the trade I mentioned. It means merchants can trade further within the empire. People can travel around. Goods, ideas, languages, cultures are all, which is what the cosmopolitan aspect of it, are transmitted and transferred throughout the empire. You also can mobilize your troops. If they do revolt, you can get your troops there a lot faster, and the supply line, than if you don't have roads. So roads played a fundamental aspect in the success of keeping that. Sure, you have the positive aspect of it, and you have the punitive of, like, we have the best soldiers and we're going to destroy you, as well as the reminder that Darius did with killing so many Babylonian citizens. You don't want that to happen to you. But the royal highways really were, it's significant in that it connects an empire. It's why later it's the all roads lead to Rome. The Romans with their roads were seen as so important and innovative. The Persians did it first. But it's for the same reasons, because it makes it so much more effective to connect an empire. And so then you can get information quicker and know what's going on. And this connects to what they had, which was kind of like the Pony Express. I put it in this, they didn't call it that. It was the Royal Mail system. And they had a normal system, but this one was for special, for the king. And it was 1,677 miles long. They had stations set up, and then with riders, right? And so if there was an important message that the satrap needed to get to the king, it would be given to a rider, right? And they would travel to the next station. And then they would pass off the note to a fresh rider and a fresh horse who would travel fast to the next station. And so you have this relay station that was super effective. That meant that from one end to the other of the empire, if they were using the fastest, like Pony Express method and stuff, you could get in 5 to 7 days, you could get there with a note, right? Not one in person, but within this system. So this is, think about how effective this is. So let's say a satrap is like, this region or this city is thinking of revolting, or they've revolted. You send the message to the king, it gets there, and usually it's not from one end to the other, right? Persepolis is kind of central, so it's like 3 days. So then the king gets the message that they're revolting. And pre this system of the royal highway and this mail system, it could take months for the king to hear about a revolt. Then it would take, so let's say 3 months. And then it would take another 3 to 4 months to mobilize your troops and get them there. Which means a city-state would be like, or a kingdom would be like, we have 6 months after we revolt to train, to prepare, and be ready for them. With this system, right, because the next thing of what the roads do is mobilization of troops. Okay, right, which is both supplies and the people. So with this system, not only do you get the news that there is a revolt, but then you can mobilize your troops and get them there within a month, right? Because the roads, it's easier to travel. You can bring a larger supply line and chain and everything else like that. So something that they used to have 6 months to prep for, you know how to, at max, a month to do. And then you were going up against the largest army. So it's super effective in being able to respond quickly. But it doesn't have to be just to the level of revolt. Let's say the satrap just says, like, these people aren't happy. Well, the king can then respond to that and hopefully cut off and fix the problem before it becomes so discontented that they revolt. Right, so the extreme is the revolt, the notification and mobilization of troops. The more common usage was to keep an eye and ear on what was going on throughout the entire kingdom or empire and be able to respond to any issues relatively quick and fix the problem before it became worse. But then you also have, as mentioned, trade and travel. You're going to have now that this provides merchants and goods are going to love this because they're going to be able to sell more stuff. People are going to get accustomed to a variety of goods and services that they otherwise wouldn't have if you didn't have such an interconnected system, right? Think about it as not just the goods, but ideas and knowledge as well. All of this is getting passed around, because of that connectivity of the empire. So the royal highways were super important in that. So that's that system. So the question, right? How does the administration be so effective? That's how. All right. The next part that we're going to look at, what are we on? 6, I think now. I think, let's see. I lost my number system. Maybe just 4. That was 3. So here we go. So 4. Looking at the cultural aspects. I mentioned the other question was, right, how are they different from Mesopotamia and some of that? Well, one of the big cultural differences was, we'll say general, because of the wealth part of it, but also some of the other traditional aspects, general life of, we'll say, the upper class and the king, right? And that group. Of course, the lower classes, it's different. The Persians were overall generally wealthier than non-Persians, but especially the upper class, the nobility and the king lived this life of luxury. They were extremely wealthy. To give you an example of this, when when Alexander the Great was attacking Persia, the king's name was Darius too, by the way, but not this Darius. It was several Dariuses later. He brought an entire entourage with him when he went to a battle. The kings didn't go fight all the battles, which was also something different. You see in Greece, in some areas in Mesopotamia, the kings often went into battle. Here, the Persian king did not go into battle. We could put that, right? The Persian king they didn't go into battle unless it was a really important one that they thought they were going to win, usually. So like, oh, this battle is going to set the scene and we need to go. So for Alexander the Great, again, it's a different Darius, but Darius took this entourage and they set up a massive tent. His wife and children, his daughters, I believe, went with him. He brought a solid gold bathtub and then a whole chest full of spices, which was over a year's wages for an upper class Macedonian. So a solid gold bathtub. They brought silk clothing. That was common. Clothing was for the upper classes was silk, which is extremely expensive. The fact that to a battlefield, you set up a massive tent area with servants, with your family, with solid gold bathtubs, because you got to stay clean before and after a battle. It wasn't right on the battlefield, right? It was set up behind, quite a ways behind the battlefield. But nonetheless, that you bring this luxury with you, right? Then the capital in Persepolis in the palace was even more luxurious, and they certainly didn't do labor. The upper class, they didn't sew. They all of that work was done for them, and they kind of looked beneath that of, we don't sew, we don't wear cotton clothing, we wear silk, and the whole capital was surrounded in this luxury, and the king and the upper class nobility even so much more, and that level of wealth was something that even like Egypt and Mesopotamia didn't have in the same way. Egypt more than Mesopotamia, but it still wasn't the same. And then the fact, like I said, that the Persian kings tended to be, that kind of goes to the why they didn't always go into battle. We'll say involvement. In this case, this was more like Egypt. The king was not seen by many people. Right, so kind of like Old Kingdom Egyptian rulers, or even China, in China, the Chinese kings or emperors. This was common, that the emperors, the kings, had like their advisors and a small group of people who saw them, but access to the king was extremely limited. Versus Mesopotamia, they're a shepherd and they're supposed to be seen, and they went out and interacted with the people. And we'll see in parts of Greece that was the same with rulers and leaders. And yet here you have the king. So they definitely had more of that kind of what's considered or called Eastern culture, in terms of if it was much more similar to kind of the Chinese structure of kingship than it was Mesopotamian or Greek structure of rule. So they weren't seen by many people. The benefit of this is it protects from assassinations. It also can kind of create this mythical view of the king, right? Where that they somehow are kind of all powerful. Or by the way, the Persians did not see their kings as gods at all. That if you ever watched like 300, that kind of they made it out like Xerxes, that people thought Xerxes was a god. I mean, and I know it's a movie and stuff, but that's not true at all. They were king of kings, they were people, but no Persian believed their king was a god. Instead, it was just this mythical aspect of the king, of he was, elusive and unknown, and that made him more, not only mysterious, but more powerful. They also did a practice with, I guess we'll put under involvement of the king, prostration. And we'll say deference, which should sound somewhat like filial piety, by the way, where you always had to be lower than the king. And if people who had an audience with the king would often come in and lay down on their knees and then put their hands straight out and bow down with the hands and their forehead touching the floor. If you did extreme prostration, then your knees were flat too. Your whole body, you just laid flat, face first on the floor, arms stretched out, right? That was meant to show extreme deference to the king. It also meant that you didn't challenge the king's word. This can be problematic because this can get you to a lot of like yes men, if you will, that just agree with whatever the king said and no one ever suggested. And we saw this addressed in the Mandate of Heaven and Confucianism with filial piety. The problem of not telling a king, that's probably not the best idea, can be, not a good thing. And so that was part of that cultural aspect as well. All right, the last thing we're going to look at, and then I'll show the rest of the pictures after this, is the religion. So we'll do religious structure. As I mentioned with Cyrus, when it started out, they were polytheistic like everyone else, but that changed with Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is actually the Greek name for it. And it was founded or structured by Zoroaster, which again we'll put here. This was the Greek name given. If you're looking for it, his Persian name is Zarathustra. But of course, the Zoroastrianism stuck with what we call it today. This is around 600 BCE that he started this. Now, 600 BCE, that's not when it took hold in Persia, where then that's what they adapted to. The founder, Zoroaster, he wanted to, his goal, let's say, what was to eradicate polytheism. So he had a very specific goal with that. Animal sacrifice and what he called magic. Okay, so that was the intended purpose of the religion. This was one of the things with it was also this idea of worship of an ethical concept rather than a ritualistic nature. So let's see, the goal, this is still a goal, right? Transition, and it's what happened with that. Put here, to worship an ethical concept, right, rather than ritualistic nature or actions, ritualistic practices, let's say. Okay, so when he set it up, the supreme deity was Ahura Mazda. Now, if Zoroaster had gotten his way, this probably would have been a monotheistic religion. He wanted Ahura Mazda to be really the only god. And Ahura Mazda was called the Wise Lord. And he was the god of light, truth, righteousness, justice, right? Everything that was good. Okay, that's right. He was the good God, the one of light, the one of good, and that was the principles that he embodied. One of the things that happened is that the kind of people who followed him kind of said, well, how if you only have this good God that's wise and it's about light and truth and justice and righteousness, how do you explain evil in the world? And so he ends up creating you call it a counter deity, but initially was far less, who his name was Ahriman. So Ahriman was one used to explain evil in the world, but also then embodies the principles of darkness, like I said, evil, treacherous, lies, right? Things like that. Let's see. We'll put under him still. So initially, this was a lesser deity, lesser being. I wouldn't even put it as a god, right? It wasn't human, but it was a lesser being. However, after Zoroaster's death, right, the main priest, they changed it to being equal with Ahura Mazda. And so this is why I say it's more of a dualistic religion than monotheistic, because you basically have dual gods that not under Zoroaster's initial plan, but what became of it is that you have Ahura Mazda and you have Ahriman, right? And this is good God, bad God, essentially. And they are locked in a long struggle, right? That this is that dualistic aspect of it. So they're locked in this long struggle, and that eventually the Ahura Mazda would win. So it's already been decided that Ahura Mazda will win. But it's going to be thousands and thousands of years before that happens, right? And then, so Ahriman will be defeated, good defeats evil, that type of thing, right? But this was talked about in terms of thousands and thousands of years in the future. When this happens, this will kickstart off Judgment Day, essentially. And you have, kind of two things that emerge from that. Kind of a resurrection of the dead, which this should sound very much like with Judaism, with the Hebrews, we'll say, right? The Israelites, their belief that comes with that. And then you're going to get the afterlife. And there's two choices that occur. There's if you followed the path of light, right, it is a good place, right? If you follow the path of darkness, which is, right, Ahura Mazda is light, Ahriman is darkness, then it's a place of punishment. This should sound an awful lot like Christianity, specifically their concepts of heaven and hell. So one of the things that's significant is that Zoroastrianism definitely influenced the structure of Christianity, but also possibly with the Hebrews, or that they took from the Hebrews when it was developed. The Hebrews didn't initially have a concept of the afterlife. Outside of it was the afterlife. And the resurrection of the dead came later too. So there is some discussion about who influenced what, but definitely there's enough imagery and language from Zoroastrianism that definitely came before Christianity, and that is suggested that Christianity borrowed from in describing and shaping and trying to put their ideas into words. And that they were influenced by, and many, the Romans, accused the Christians of being influenced by Eastern religions. And that would have qualified for, at their view of what Eastern was at the time, with the that Persians with Zoroastrianism. And the last thing then about the religion that I want to talk about is, or 6 here, is just this other concept that should also sound similar to both the Hebrews that they actually probably got from them. Because again, there's kind of some give and take here. And then later Christianity. A personal and individual religion. Okay? So, the focus is private over public ritual, right? And that you have a personal relationship with, right, Ahura Mazda, ideally. Or Ahriman, I guess, if you make the bad choice. There is a significant aspect of encouraging free will and choice. That should sound very much like monotheism with the Hebrews. That was definitely before Zoroastrianism. So this was also, whereas the other influenced probably the Hebrews, this was most likely, viewed, borrowed from the Hebrews. So again, that give and take of the connection to it. That basically this was this moral expectation in your choices. And you had free will to make that choice, to choose good or bad. But ultimately that there was a moral aspect of your behavior and that it mattered, because ultimately you would be judged based on those choices. And then in general beliefs, right, what are the goals, I suppose, because you still have Ahriman as the negative to this, the opposite, was truth, as we mentioned, right? Love, hospitality. And that you are, as mentioned, morally responsible for your actions. And this was very different than Mesopotamia, right? One, they don't have an animal sacrifice. That was different from the Hebrews, but Christianity got rid of sacrifice as well. But for this time frame, right, that's very different from the polytheist religions. No animal sacrifice. And then you have a personal relationship with the gods. But really, they like I said, what makes both the monotheism and Zoroastrianism with dualistic religion unique is this free will, this moral responsibility, this idea of having a relationship with God, that your choices matter, and that you're responsible for those choices, ultimately choosing good or bad in the end. So you're morally responsible for your choices. And then that afterlife is kind of, they were the first to do this, that there was a reward to the afterlife. What have we looked at with afterlife so far? They're just there, like the ancestors are spirits, or Mesopotamia where it's kind of sucky, but it's not meant to be a punishment. It just sucks because, life sucks. And there's no, even Egypt, it's a positive afterlife, but it's not deemed a reward till the new kingdom. And so it just is this place. And here you now have an afterlife that's directly connected to this idea of a reward for that. And this definitely influenced, the idea of the kingship and their responsibility to other people. If you're looking at, this idea of hospitality, tolerance of other beliefs, right? The fact that they allowed for people to have and practice their own cultures. This influenced the not Cambyses, but it influenced Darius and even Xerxes and others. Those tributary states, they were to treat benevolent. One of those, benevolently doesn't sound like a word. Benevolent. They were to be benevolent to them. Sorry, my figuring out words late at night when my brain's starting to shut down. They were to treat them with and be benevolent to them. That they were to let them practice and have tolerance and show them kindness. Right? You weren't supposed to go out just destroying and raping and pillaging and looting. Didn't mean that it didn't have put down harshly revolts when it happened and there was a necessity to it, but it certainly created this kind of more kinder, tolerant culture within the empire, because that was the kind of main tenet of the religion. All right, we're going to stop there. But like I said, definitely think about how Zoroastrianism and Judaism, what becomes Judaism with the Hebrews and the Israelites and their religious belief of monotheism, are definitely these unique two religious structures within an area of the world where you mostly have polytheism, as they kind of stood out as different, and not just by or slightly changing polytheism, but these were radical departures from a lot more of the traditional religious beliefs in many of the areas, and so that's significance of that. All right, so that's it for the Persians until we come back to talk about them with the Greeks.